the lecture for Ancient River Valley Civilizations Day 2 in the city. I'm going to be doing these presentations this way rather than including the text written on there because I think it makes it easier, first of all, and second of all, because it's quicker for me to do it this way. Anyway, let's get started. Alright, so these are the Ancient River Valley Civilizations. Remember, this is a Neolithic image, and different from our Paleolithic image in the ways that we talked about in class. I want you to remember this map. Again, we're looking at this map for the 4,516,290th time. We're seeing human beings taking over out of Africa, right? Human Homo sapiens coming out of Africa about 200,000 years ago, going on up and through this part of the world, right? Up through here, which is China today. Okay, and then they branch off and take off elsewhere. What I want you to notice is where they are along this line. When we look here, which are the first cities, what we see is that the places where the first cities are right along that same line. Okay, right along that same stretch where they went through up through China. Okay, so these are the original cities. Egypt, Mesopotamia, there's some cities in there. In the Indus and Ganges River valleys, we mostly just talk about the Indus River valleys in this course, and what it says here, the Yellow River Valley, which is also the Huanghe River Valley. And again, you see it there, Nile River, Tigris and Euphrates River, Indus River, and Huanghe River Valley. Indus and Huanghe. All right, so let's start with Egypt. This is one we're all familiar with. We've all heard of Egypt. This is a great still from the movie Ten Commandments, starring Charlton Heston. Excellent movie. Okay, so we see a map of Africa, just so we know. I hope you're all familiar with Africa by this point. Up in the top right-hand corner, or in map speak, the northeast of Africa, we see Egypt. It borders the Mediterranean Sea. As we get closer to Egypt, you can see that out into the Mediterranean, you see this river that runs all the way through, which is, of course, the Nile. That's probably the most famous river in the world. Egyptian civilization began in the Nile River Valley, in this green part that you see here, up and down the river, and didn't really expand outside of that area. This is just to help you remember that it's the Nile River Valley is what's near the pyramids. Now, the Nile River, it's a peaceful river, right? I mean, it's a nice place to live. I guess it's a little dangerous because there are Nile crocodiles. So that's something of a concern. But in general, the river itself is actually very peaceful. It floods at the same time every year like clockwork. And so people who live in the Nile River Valley don't have to worry about unexpected flooding or things like that, right? They just, the river floods when it's supposed to. So it's peaceful. Now you might ask, why do we want a river to flood? Well, as it turns out, actually the original river valley civilizations were very good because this stuff that's at the bottom of a river that you're seeing in this bucket here, that's actually got lots of dead plant material and great fertilizer. It's like a compost heap, and it's all stuck down at the bottom of a river. It floods right on schedule, like I said, like the Nile floods right on schedule, and all that nice nutrient-rich sort of stuff that's at the bottom of the river comes up. And this makes your plants and your crops grow very well. And so that's why people who live in the Nile River Valley they sort of see the river as peaceful, right? And it's helping them grow their crops because it's bringing that stuff on a regular basis very easily. As a result, the people in the Nile River Valley are very well fed. They're not overly concerned about the natural forces and things like this that are going to try to destroy their life. Okay, and so when you think about Egypt, I mean, you can think about this image, right? In Egypt, obviously not for everyone, but for most people, life is good. All right, so let's talk about Mesopotamia. Now, in Mesopotamia, it's a little bit of a different story. This image here, I'm just selected to show you sort of how big these old societies got, right? This is, I think, Babylon, which is one of the Mesopotamian civilizations. Now, if you're wondering where Mesopotamia is, again, we see Africa here, and this little red box is centered in on something that we call the Middle East. Okay, it's called the Middle East because it's between Africa, which is sort of center, And then the Far East is China and Asia. So the Middle East is sort of not quite all that way out there. We call that the Middle East, and that's that region. If we zoom in on that, you'll see that same shape. There's Egypt again, the northeastern part of Africa. This shape here is sort of rectangular, kind of looks like an axe head, I guess. That's the Middle East, and up here is Mesopotamia in this red box. Now we can scroll in a little bit closer on that, and now you see something interesting. You see two rivers, okay? You see two rivers, and Mesopotamia is the land sort of technically between those rivers. I don't know if you've ever heard of Sumer. You see the Sumerian, Acadia, the Akkadians, Kish, a couple other places that maybe you have heard of before, maybe not. But you see those two rivers. Those, and Mesopotamia literally means between the rivers. Those two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Okay, so the Tigris is on the western side and the Euphrates is on the eastern side. And this is the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley civilization. That's what's in Mesopotamia. Now, life in the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys is a little bit more like this. It's not like the meditating person on the beach. And what we mean by this is, while the Nile River floods at predictable intervals, like they know that it's going to flood on time, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flood completely unpredictably. And as a result, the people who live in the Mesopotamian River Valley sort of see the world as a chaotic and harsh place, and their views of the gods are similar, whereas the Egyptian views of the gods are that the gods are constant and sort of have their act together. Like I said, that they don't flood on time. There's no schedule for the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys to flood, and so at inopportune times, unexpected times, there's flooding in the Mesopotamia region in the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. So in Mesopotamia, you might say that life is in chaos. This is the way that sort of Mesopotamians can view their life and view the world around them as sort of chaotic. All right, now the Indus River Valley. The Indus River Valley, like the name implies, is roughly in what we would modernly call India. And here you see that on the map. Now, India today is part of what we would call Southern Asia, but it used to be part of the East, what we would consider the East. And here's India in the green inside this red box. And if we zoom in a bit, you can see that same shape, that sort of teardrop shape. And up in the northwestern corner, you see the Indus River, and there's the Ganges rivers out there too, but we mostly talk about the Indus River in this class, like I said. And the Indus River Valley civilization is what cropped up right there around the Indus River itself. Now, the Indus River floods, or used to flood, pretty much on schedule. So that's actually not the interesting thing in terms of figuring out how to remember what Indus Valley civilization was like. The interesting thing about the Indus Valley civilization was, here we see sort of a very complex, complicated grid system, right? And you might have thought that, the earliest cities, the first cities, would sort of be like this, sort of messy and things built sort of all over the place, and you wouldn't be able to find anything, as things kind of just grew on top of them. But actually, as it turns out, the Indus River Valley civilization was actually a lot more like this. That's right, the cities that they built in the Indus River Valley, we're talking about the first cities ever built, among the first cities ever built in the world, and we're talking about very straight streets, open avenues. They also had underwater sewers in the Indus River Valley civilizations, or not underwater, underground sewers to run wastewater and things out. They had public baths, which seems like kind of a weird idea today, but in a time before nobody even had a bath before, so this is kind of an amazing thing, right? That you would have baths for everybody to use so people could be clean. And so this is another interesting thing, they didn't have weapons, right? There's been no evidence found of any kind of weapons at all in the Indus River Valley civilizations, and very little evidence of any war. Okay, so when we think about living in the Indus River Valley civilizations, we could kind of think about living in sort of a nice hotel, right? It's very clean, it's designed so that people can move around easily, and nobody's bothering you, nobody's fighting, right? So the Indus River Valley was something like a nice hotel in terms of the old first cities. And finally, today we're going to talk about the Huanghe River Valley. This obviously statue was not there in the ancient times. It's just it's something that's along the Yellow River today. Now the Huanghe River is in China, which is what we would say the Far East. And here's a close-up of China. I want to show you, if you go back, that same shape, that orange shape is this. This is China. And here you see where it says Yellow River. That's the Huanghe River. The Yellow River, I think, is sort of the Western name for it. And when you think of the flooding patterns of the Huanghe River, I want you to think about this image, okay? Because the Huanghe River floods so often and so catastrophically that it is also often called the River of Sorrows, okay? So you see Michael Jordan, he's a little bit upset. He's crying. You know, I just want you to think about that. When you think of Huanghe River, I want you to think of crying, right? Because it's the River of Sorrows. It is also extremely long, okay? The Huanghe River is very, very long, and that creates an interesting thing along the Huanghe River. Whereas most of these civilizations we're talking about, most of these areas had one kind of civilization in the whole region. The Huanghe River was so long that it's actually characterized by having a lot of different kinds of cultures and civilizations along it at the same time. This is a famous image from the Olympics that just happened this year, where you see an Egyptian woman playing a German woman in beach volleyball. And you can see the clash of cultures, the clash of sort of styles in terms of how they're dressed for the game. You know, in the Huanghe River civilization, it's kind of a lot like the sort of world that people describe today, that, you know, sort of an ideal world of diversity where, you know, people of different kinds and people of different cultures can meet and work together. And the Huanghe River Valley sort of was something like this. Now, something else they had there was to keep all this together. They did have, at that time, a form of kingship or monarchy in a way. We're not exactly going to go into how in depth how that works, but basically just you understand that the Huanghe River had monarchies there. So I kind of think when I was thinking of an example for this, I sort of thought that the Huanghe River was something like the World of Warcraft, right? You've got a massive world that is inhabited by lots of different kinds of cultures and societies, and it's ruled in some cases by some sort of kings or monarchs. And so you can think of the Huanghe River Valley civilization something like World of Warcraft. All right, so these are the things that you would write down for your notes, or come back here and see this if you want the notes. Now, we're all familiar with Coke and Pepsi, right, and the rivalry they have. And basically what we've been talking about so far are the sort of Cokes and Pepsis of the ancient world, right? These are the big-time Mesopotamia, Egypt, Huanghe River, Indus River. These are sort of the big-time major players in the world at that time. But, you know, there's RC Cola, too, in the world. I don't know if you've ever had it, but RC is a brand that's been around, like it says, since 1905. And it does have considerable market share, particularly in the Deep South. Just like RC Cola, there were other societies going on at the same time that I think it's important to know about. First, that you've probably heard of, the Hebrews, right? The Jews. This is, again, Charlton Heston from that movie, Ten Commandments. He's playing Moses here, okay? So we have the Hebrews. Now, the Hebrews lived where this, we would say number 2, right there, which is actually between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. That was the area where the Hebrews were located. Now, these civilizations we're going to talk about here are not technically river valley civilizations, right? They're not mostly growing massive crops the way that these river valley civilizations were, and the Hebrews are not an exception to this. They're sort of a desert people, and they get by on pastoralism. Now, pastoralism is where people herd sheep, goats, different things like this, and they do some farming. It's not that they don't farm. It's just that a lot of the people in these societies are engaged in other things, and for the Hebrews, being a shepherd or a pastor of sheep is a major way of life. All right, next we have the Phoenicians. Okay, the Phoenicians. I want you to take a look at this image and really think about what you're seeing here. You've got people trading, okay, and they got trade ships. Okay, they're in very beautiful clothing, and that's actually very indicative of the Phoenicians. If you look over here on the right-hand side, this is sort of where the Phoenicians are from, which is the Mediterranean Sea, again on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea. And this sort of line that goes all the way across here, or around the around Africa and up into Europe and stuff, that sort of represents this is a Phoenician trade route. Okay, so that should tell you something about the Phoenicians, and that is that they used ships, and Phoenicians were known as traders. Okay, the Phoenicians traded goods and goods around the world, and that's how they made their living in this part of history. So they weren't necessarily big farmers either. Again, not that they didn't have farms, but they weren't massive farmers the way that the River Valley civilizations were. All right, next we have the Nubians. Right, the Nubians. Now the Nubians are an interesting case. They come from further south in Africa than the Egyptians. If you'll see up at the top of the screen there, it says Egypt, and here in the middle it says Nubia. Because of that, they shared sort of a similar culture to the Egyptians, right? With the main differences that being that the Nubians were famous for sort of herding cattle, like they did a lot with cattle, and then also sort of legendarily, the Nubians are known for vast richness in gold. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily established in history, but definitely in legend, the Nubians are sort of thought of as being very rich in gold. Most famously, the Nubians are famous, I guess, for being friends with the Egyptians. And in fact, several Egyptian pharaohs were Nubians. They came from Nubia. So that's sort of how the Nubians connect to the larger civilizations that were out there, the Egypts and the Mesopotamias. The Nubians were neighbors of the Egyptians, and they had good relations with them most of the time. And so this would be the rest of the notes for that, and I thank you for watching.